Hi, welcome to Ms. Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 4.20, Challenges to Conformity, Part 2. It includes information that goes along with the Section 4 on your Unit 4 study guide. Remember, you have control over this, so pause whenever you need to, rewatch if you need, and use your study guide to help you take your notes. Let's go ahead and get started. We've been learning about groups that were unable or unwilling to conform in the 1950s. Today we'll look at the two groups that were unwilling to act like the rest of America, teenagers and beatniks. First, we're going to talk about teenagers and how they influence society. So teenagers as a term did not even exist before World War II. Americans went from being children to adults. They got jobs, they helped pay for housing, food, clothing. Think about the progressive era that we learned about in Unit 1. There was no time to be a teen. You went to being an adult, and sometimes very early on. Being a teenager is unique to having money. You have to have affluence. Once the country became prosperous, teens could take more time to grow up, per se. In 1900, 1 in 8 teens was in school because most were working. By 1950, 6 in 8 were in school. So that's going to change American culture. Teenagers and parents had different ideas of culture. While teens did not necessarily conform to the traditional ideas their parents did, they conformed to a teen culture. One aspect of this was to revere the rebels. Think about the movie Grease. The T-Birds, the Pink Ladies, they're the rebels. Sandy and the Jocks, they were conforming. But who was the hero? Right? The rebel. So you liked them best. This can be seen in other movies as well. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, or Marlon Brando in The Wild One. These romanticize the idea of juvenile delinquency. Teens saw their suburban lives as boring. They felt misunderstood and alone. These rebels were hip, which is cool, and exciting. It was another area where teens clashed. There was also another area where teens clashed with their parents that also seemed hip and exciting, and that was rock and roll. Rock and roll was born in the 50s from rhythm and blues. This music was risque, it included sexual overtones in the lyrics, and often was played by black musicians. So that was a big deal. Parents hated it, and kids loved it. So some teenagers even went further in their rebellion, questioning the government and society and intentionally challenging the norms. These young people are called the Beat Generation, or beatniks. Beatniks were very different than the typical teenager. While typical teens were trying to figure out who they were, and ultimately they ended up very much like their peers and later their parents, the beatniks, or beats, were intentionally different and actively challenging the American ideal. They protested traditional American values. They stressed spontaneity and spirituality, but not religion. And they were against mainstream conformity. This group was very artistic. They created and endorsed literature and film dealing with alienation. You may have read some of their work in English class. For example, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, or Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Kerouac himself may be someone you've heard of because not only was he one of the leaders of the Beat movement and very famous for that, he actually spent a lot of time in Denver, especially when he was active in the Beat movement. So these were the hippies of the 50s, if you want to think of them that way. This is before there were hippies. Many were homeless, or lived together with many others in small apartments. They moved frequently. They didn't hold normal jobs, or really any jobs. Several of them committed criminal actions, often repeatedly, and they didn't feel bad for it. Most suburban teens were never going to rebel to that extent, but those who did held a certain appeal all the same for teenagers. So this is the end of U.S. Notes 4.20. I hope you learned something. I'll see you in class with any questions you have.